Imagine the confined elegance of a first-class cabin soaring over the Atlantic, the hum of the engines masking hidden tensions. Now picture a sudden death, a missing journal, and a plane where every passenger has something to hide. In Murder at 30,000 feet, every glance, every word, and every move could be a clue or a lie. Buckle in, this mystery at cruising altitude will keep you guessing until the final descent. The bustling hum of Heathrow Airport served as an overture to the drama about to unfold. Beneath the brightly lit ceilings of Terminal 5, Evelyn Carter moved with the practiced ease of a seasoned traveler. Her practical leather shoes made no sound against the polished floors as she navigated through the throng of hurried passengers. At 71, Evelyn had perfected the art of blending in. Neither remarkable nor invisible, just another face in the tide of humanity flowing toward the gates. A retired nurse with a penchant for adventure, Evelyn had cultivated a quiet appreciation for observing people. Airports, she often thought, were a perfect study in human behavior. Tonight, however, her mind was less on her fellow travelers and more on the flight ahead. A first-class ticket to New York was an indulgence, a gift to herself after years of careful saving. The promise of spacious seats, attentive service, and a restful journey filled her with quiet satisfaction. At Gate 23, Evelyn paused, surveying the small cluster of passengers who would share her flight. A quick glance confirmed what she had suspected. Most of her fellow first-class travelers were already waiting. The exclusivity of first class brought with it a curious mixture of entitlement and unease, and Evelyn couldn't help but notice the tension simmering beneath the surface. Robert Kingsley stood apart from the others, a tall man with silver-threaded hair and a tailored navy suit that hinted at quiet wealth. His posture was impeccable, but Evelyn's trained eye caught the subtle signs of strain. The furrow in his brow, the way his hand lingered near his pocket as if guarding a secret. He was speaking to a woman, her blonde hair swept into a sleek chignon. The woman, Camilla Harrington, Evelyn recalled from the passenger list displayed at the check-in counter, was impeccably dressed, her red lips moving quickly as she gestured toward Robert with nervous energy. Whatever she was saying, Robert seemed unimpressed, responding curtly before turning away to glance at his phone. Nearby, a man sat with his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the departure board. Dr. Alan Pembroke's reputation preceded him. Evelyn had read about his groundbreaking surgical techniques in a glossy magazine months ago. In person, he seemed smaller, his tailored suit hanging loosely on his frame. His reserved demeanor might have been mistaken for calm, but there was something guarded in the way he avoided meeting anyone's eyes. Maggie York was impossible to ignore. The journalist had a commanding presence, her sharp features and dark bob giving her the air of someone who thrived on confrontation. She held a tablet in one hand, scrolling with the intensity of someone searching for their next scoop. When her gaze landed on the group, her lips curled into a faint, knowing smile, as if she'd already uncovered everyone's secrets. Victor Lyle hovered at the edges, a financial advisor with a perpetually damp brow and a habit of glancing over his shoulder. His briefcase rested on the floor beside him, but his grip on its handle suggested he wasn't prepared to part with it any time soon. Evelyn noted the slight tremor in his hands as he fumbled with his boarding pass. Then there was Ava Sinclair, the youngest of the group. Her chic attire and poised demeanor screamed ambition, yet Evelyn caught a flicker of something else, nervous energy bubbling just beneath the surface. Ava's eyes darted toward Robert and Camilla with a mix of curiosity and unease, and she seemed to flinch whenever Maggie's gaze settled on her. The announcement of boarding broke the tension momentarily, and the group began to file toward the jet bridge. Evelyn followed at a measured pace, her eyes lingering on Robert as he paused to make a call. He turned slightly away from the group, lowering his voice as he spoke into his phone. Though she couldn't make out the entire conversation, the words, "This has to end tonight," carried over the hum of the crowd, chilling her more than the January air seeping through the terminal doors. The first-class cabin was a cocoon of luxury, its muted lighting and plush seats designed to lull passengers into a sense of comfort. Evelyn settled into her window seat, taking a moment to appreciate the quiet opulence. Her seat was 2 rows behind Robert's, offering her a clear view of his interactions with the others. Camilla sat beside him, her movements sharp and deliberate as she arranged her belongings. Maggie, ever the observer, took the seat diagonally across from them, her tablet still in hand. Alan and Victor occupied the middle row, while Ava chose a seat closer to the aisle, her posture stiff as she pulled out a notebook. The flight attendant moved through the cabin, offering drinks and warm towels. Evelyn accepted a glass of water, watching as Robert declined his drink with a wave of his hand. Camilla leaned in to whisper something to him, her face tight with concern. Robert's response was inaudible, but his expression was stony, and Camilla's shoulders sagged as she turned away. As the plane taxied down the runway, Evelyn felt the familiar tug of curiosity. The interactions she had witnessed so far hinted at hidden conflicts and unspoken grievances. Years of working in hospital wards had taught her to read people, to see the stories etched in their faces and movements. Tonight, the first-class cabin was a stage, and its passengers were players in a drama she couldn't yet decipher. The engines roared, and the plane lifted into the sky, leaving the lights of London behind. Evelyn leaned back, closing her eyes as the hum of the aircraft filled her ears. Yet sleep eluded her, and her thoughts kept drifting back to the passengers around her. Something about this group felt different, a sense of tension that went beyond the usual pretense and politeness of first-class travel. Evelyn opened her eyes, her gaze falling on Robert. His face was turned toward the window, but his reflection in the glass betrayed a flicker of unease. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small notebook. Camilla glanced at it but said nothing, her fingers clutching the armrest as if holding herself back. As the plane settled into its cruising altitude, Evelyn made a silent vow to pay attention. She didn't know why, but instinct told her that this flight would be anything but ordinary. The cabin was shrouded in an almost unnatural stillness, the dimmed lights casting long shadows over the sleek interior. A few hours into the flight, most passengers had succumbed to the quiet lull of the journey. Evelyn Carter, however, remained restless. She sat upright, gazing out at the black expanse of the Atlantic below, her mind drawn to the peculiar undercurrents she had sensed earlier. The soft chime of a call button broke her reverie. A flight attendant appeared, moving briskly toward the front of the cabin. Evelyn's gaze followed, curiosity stirring when she noticed Camilla Harrington rising from her seat to speak to the attendant. Their conversation was brief but urgent, Camilla gesturing toward Robert Kingsley, who remained slouched in his seat. Evelyn watched with growing concern as the flight attendant leaned in, placing a hand on Robert's shoulder. A moment later, the attendant straightened abruptly, her composed mask slipping as she pressed the call button repeatedly. Another crew member appeared, and the muted hum of the cabin seemed to grow louder, the tension palpable. Evelyn rose instinctively, her years of medical training overriding any hesitation. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm a retired nurse. May I assist?" The flight attendant hesitated before nodding, stepping aside as Evelyn approached. Robert's head had lolled to one side, his eyes closed. His once vibrant complexion had taken on an ashen hue, and there was a faint sheen of perspiration on his forehead. Evelyn's practiced hands reached for his wrist, searching for a pulse she already suspected she wouldn't find. As she leaned closer, a faint, bitter scent reached her nose. Almonds. Her heart quickened, though she maintained her outward composure. The scent was distinct, unmistakable even after all these years. Evelyn's mind briefly flashed to a patient she'd once treated, a man who had ingested cyanide in a desperate attempt to end his life. The symptoms had been hauntingly similar: bluish lips, cold sweat, the faint trace of almonds lingering in the air. This was no natural death. Evelyn straightened, meeting the flight attendant's wide-eyed gaze. "He's gone," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "I believe this may be a case of poisoning." The flight attendant's face blanched, her professionalism faltering. "Poisoning?" she whispered, the word barely audible. Evelyn nodded. "I can't be certain without further examination, but the scent of almonds is distinct. Cyanide poisoning is a possibility." She paused, lowering her voice further. "We need to act quickly and discreetly. The other passengers must not be alarmed." The attendant glanced over her shoulder. her gaze flickering toward the economy cabin. "What do you suggest?" "Secure the first-class cabin," Evelyn said, her tone firm but calm. "Speak with the captain and ensure no one leaves this section. We must keep the situation contained until we land." As the attendant moved to relay the message, Evelyn turned her attention to the remaining passengers. Camilla had sunk into her seat, her face pale and drawn. Maggie York watched intently, her sharp features betraying a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Victor Lyle fidgeted with his briefcase, his movements jerky and nervous. Dr. Alan Pembroke appeared outwardly composed, but his hands were clasped tightly together, the knuckles white. Ava Sinclair sat stiffly, her notebook clutched against her chest like a shield. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, his calm yet authoritative tone cutting through the growing tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a medical emergency in the first-class cabin. I must ask that all passengers remain seated while our crew manages the situation. Thank you for your cooperation." Evelyn noted the subtle shifts in the room. Camilla's eyes darted toward Robert's lifeless form, her breath quickening. Victor avoided looking at the body altogether, instead focusing intently on the seat back in front of him. Maggie's gaze remained unflinching, her pen poised as if she were mentally cataloging every detail. The head flight attendant returned, her expression grim. "The captain has agreed to secure the first-class cabin," she informed Evelyn. "We've asked the crew to monitor the economy section closely. What should we do next?" "We need to preserve the scene as much as possible," Evelyn replied. "No one should touch anything near Mr. Kingsley's seat." She paused, her eyes scanning the passengers. It would also be wise to keep everyone in their seats for the time being. The attendant nodded, retreating to relay the instructions. Evelyn returned to her seat, her mind racing. The scent of almonds, the discoloration, it was too specific to ignore. Someone on this plane had murdered Robert Kingsley, and until they landed, they were all trapped together. Evelyn's gaze lingered on the passengers, her instincts honing in on their subtle reactions. Camilla seemed paralyzed, her hands gripping the armrests as though to anchor herself. Victor's unease was evident in his darting eyes and trembling fingers. Alan Pembroke maintained a stoic facade, though Evelyn noted the way his jaw tightened whenever Robert's name was mentioned. Maggie, ever the observer, seemed to relish the unfolding drama, her piercing eyes taking in every nuance. Ava, by contrast, appeared almost too calm, her hands steady as she flipped through her notebook. The silence in the cabin was oppressive, broken only by the occasional hum of the engines. Evelyn knew that the answers lay within this confined space, among this unlikely cast of characters. It was only a matter of time before the truth surfaced. For now, all she could do was watch and wait, her instincts attuned to the slightest crack in the facade of civility that bound them all. The hum of the engines became a constant undertone, a low vibration that filled the tense silence of the first-class cabin. The isolation was palpable now, the luxurious space transformed into a gilded cage. Evelyn Carter sat upright, her keen eyes flitting from one passenger to the next. The faint scent of almonds lingered in her mind, a spectral reminder of Robert Kingsley's untimely death. Evelyn had always trusted her instincts, and they told her that this was no ordinary tragedy. Someone in this cabin held the answers, and she intended to find them. Camilla Harrington sat closest to Robert's now empty seat, her head bowed and her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Evelyn noted the pallor of her skin and the tension in her shoulders. Camilla had been visibly distraught when Robert's body was discovered, but her behavior had since shifted. There was a stiffness to her movements, as though she were guarding something, an emotion or a secret. Evelyn leaned in slightly, her voice calm but probing. "Miss Harrington, you seem particularly close to Mr. Kingsley. Were you assisting him on this trip?" Camilla's head snapped up, her eyes wide. No, well, not exactly," she stammered. Her manicured fingers twisted together, betraying her unease. "I work for him, or rather, I worked for him. I was his assistant." "And what was the nature of your work?" Evelyn pressed gently. Camilla hesitated, her gaze flickering to the window as if searching for an escape. "I handled his schedule, correspondence, things like that. He was demanding, but generous, until recently, that is." Evelyn arched a brow. "Recently?" A flush rose to Camilla's cheeks. "He accused me of mishandling funds. she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't true, of course, but he wouldn't listen. He said he'd fire me if I didn't repay every cent. Evelyn's sharp eyes caught a fleeting movement, Camilla's hand brushing against her wrist. There, just below the sleeve of her silk blouse, was a faint bruise. Camilla noticed Evelyn's gaze and quickly pulled her sleeve down, but the gesture had already spoken volumes. Evelyn leaned back, her expression neutral. "Thank you, Miss Harrington. I'm sorry for your loss." Camilla nodded stiffly, her lips pressed into a thin line. Evelyn made a mental note to revisit the topic later. Victor Lyle was next. The financial advisor had been uncharacteristically quiet, his usual fidgeting replaced by a rigid stillness. He sat with his briefcase perched protectively on his lap, his fingers drumming nervously against the leather. "Mr. Lyle," Evelyn began, her tone light but direct. "You've worked with Mr. Kingsley before, haven't you?" Victor's head jerked up, his expression wary. Yes, I advised on some of his foundation's investments," he said quickly. "But that was years ago." Evelyn tilted her head. "Yet you're traveling together now?" "It's a coincidence," Victor insisted, his tone defensive. "I had no idea he'd be on this flight." Evelyn's gaze dropped to the briefcase, her curiosity piqued by his death grip on it. "You seem very attached to that case," she said casually. "May I ask why?" Victor blanched. "It's important documents, work-related." "Of course," Evelyn replied smoothly. "But you'll understand if I find it odd that someone so careful would leave their briefcase slightly ajar." Victor's eyes widened, and he instinctively tightened his hold on the case. Evelyn had no intention of prying it open, but her bluff paid off. Victor's panic confirmed that the contents were significant, perhaps damning. Evelyn moved on to Dr. Alan Pembroke, whose calm demeanor had been unwavering. Yet there was something in his eyes, a flicker of tension that belied his outward composure. "Dr. Pembroke, it must be difficult for a man of your profession to witness a situation like this," Evelyn said, her tone empathetic. Alan nodded. "It is," he admitted. "I've seen death before, of course, but not like this, not so sudden." Evelyn observed his trembling hands folded neatly in his lap. They were hands that should have been steady, trained for precision. "You seem uneasy," she remarked. "Are you unwell?" Alan hesitated. "It's nothing, just exhaustion." His response was too quick, too practiced. Evelyn let the moment linger before moving to Ava Sinclair. The young entrepreneur sat upright, her hands resting on the notebook she'd been scribbling in earlier. "Miss Sinclair, you mentioned earlier that you didn't know Mr. Kingsley personally," Evelyn began. "Yet I couldn't help but notice the way you reacted when his name came up." Ava's smile was brittle. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Perhaps it's nothing," Evelyn said, her tone deliberately casual. "Still, it's unusual to see such a strong reaction to a stranger's death." Ava's gaze faltered, and she busied herself with her notebook. "It's just shocking, that's all. I don't see how I could be of any help." Evelyn didn't press further, though she noted Ava's discomfort. It was Maggie York who offered an unsolicited observation. "Funny thing about Miss Sinclair," Maggie drawled, her voice tinged with amusement. "She's awfully shy for someone so ambitious, almost as if she's hiding something." Ava stiffened, her eyes narrowing at Maggie. "What exactly are you implying?" "Nothing at all," Maggie said innocently, her smile sharp as a blade. Evelyn watched the exchange with interest. Maggie's provocation seemed calculated, as though she were testing the waters. Later, as Maggie murmured to herself, Evelyn caught a fragment of her words. "Career-making scandal." The cabin felt smaller now, the air thicker with unspoken truths. Evelyn knew that these fragments of conversation, these tiny slips and gestures, were pieces of a larger puzzle. She would need to tread carefully, documenting everything, and waiting for the moment when one of them would crack. For now, the secrets hung in the air, as unrelenting as the engines that propelled them through the night. The first-class cabin was steeped in an uneasy stillness, the hum of the engines punctuated by the occasional clink of glassware or the rustle of clothing as passengers shifted in their seats. Evelyn Carter sat quietly, her keen eyes darting from face to face, cataloging every glance, every twitch, every fidget. The tension was palpable, an invisible thread stretched taut between them, ready to snap. The cabin lights dimmed further as the plane pressed on through the night, and a soft chime signaled the seatbelt sign being activated. Evelyn's attention sharpened as she noticed a subtle shift in the plane's movement, a slight but persistent rocking that hinted at worsening conditions ahead. Outside her window, the faint glow of the moon was occasionally obscured by streaks of cloud, their edges illuminated like silver etchings against the darkness. A low murmur passed between a pair of flight attendants as they moved to secure the cabin, their usually composed expressions touched by an undercurrent of unease. It happened suddenly. A sharp jolt threw Evelyn forward in her seat, the seatbelt cutting into her ribs as the plane lurched violently. Gasps and muffled cries filled the cabin as overhead compartments rattled ominously, a few snapping open to spill their contents onto the aisle below. Evelyn braced herself, gripping the armrests as the aircraft bucked and swayed, the turbulence turning the serene cabin into a scene of chaos. Amid the confusion, Evelyn's observant gaze caught something peculiar, a shadowed figure leaning toward Robert Kingsley's seat. The movement was fleeting, almost imperceptible amidst the chaos, but the glint of something metallic, a clasp perhaps, sparked a flicker of recognition in her mind. By the time the plane steadied, the figure had returned to their seat, and Robert's journal, which Evelyn distinctly remembered resting on his lap, was no longer visible. When the plane steadied, the cabin was awash in disarray. A spilled drink pooled on the carpet near Victor Lyle's seat, his briefcase askew and its latch precariously close to opening. Maggie York's tablet had skidded to the floor, and Ava Sinclair's notebook lay abandoned on her seat as she clutched the armrest, her knuckles white. Camilla Harrington was visibly shaken, her breathing shallow, while Dr. Alan Pembroke wiped his glasses with trembling hands. Evelyn exhaled slowly, her nurse's instincts taking over as she scanned the cabin for injuries. "Is everyone all right?" she asked, her voice calm yet commanding. A chorus of murmured affirmations followed, though the anxiety in the room was unmistakable. Evelyn's gaze flickered to Robert Kingsley's now empty seat, and unease prickled at her skin. Something felt wrong, though she couldn't immediately place it. The head flight attendant appeared moments later, her professional mask firmly in place despite the obvious strain. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered some unexpected turbulence," she announced. "Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We'll resume service as soon as it's safe to do so." As the attendant moved to secure the cabin, Evelyn's attention returned to Robert's belongings. His carry-on bag was still tucked neatly under the seat in front of him, but the journal was gone. Evelyn's heart quickened. She was certain it had been there before the turbulence. Rising from her seat, she approached the head flight attendant, lowering her voice to avoid alarming the others. "I need to check something," she said. "It's important." The attendant hesitated, but something in Evelyn's tone compelled her to nod. Evelyn moved deliberately, scanning the cabin for any sign of the missing journal. Her search led her to the restroom, where she found the door slightly ajar. Pushing it open, she froze. There, nestled atop a crumpled hand towel in the trash bin, was Robert's journal. Evelyn retrieved it carefully, her gloved hands turning the pages. The contents were as cryptic as she expected, filled with shorthand notes and scattered references to names and dates. One page, however, stood out. The handwriting was more deliberate, the words underlined as though Robert had been trying to emphasize their importance. Foundation records compromised, fraud exposed, final payment imminent. But something was wrong. A single page had been torn out, its jagged edges still visible where it had been ripped from the binding. The absence was glaring, and Evelyn's stomach twisted with foreboding. Whoever had discarded the journal had wanted it found incomplete. Returning to her seat, Evelyn placed the journal on the tray table and began piecing together the clues. The missing page was deliberate, a calculated act to withhold vital information. The implications were clear. Someone among them had a vested interest in silencing Robert and ensuring his secrets died with him. Evelyn's thoughts were interrupted by Victor Lyle's voice, his tone sharper than usual. "What are you doing with that?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing as he gestured to the journal. "Fulfilling my duty," Evelyn replied evenly. "You seem awfully concerned about it, Mr. Lyle." Victor's jaw tightened. "I'm concerned because this is getting out of hand. Robert's dead, and now we're digging through his belongings as if he were hiding something." "Was he?" Evelyn asked, her voice pointed. Because from where I'm sitting, it seems you might know more than you're letting on. Victor's face reddened. That's ridiculous. I barely knew the man. Barely, yet you traveled with him before, and I couldn't help but notice your briefcase nearly came open during the turbulence. Care to share what's inside? Victor's lips thinned, and he turned away, refusing to engage further. Evelyn's gaze shifted to Maggie York, who was watching the exchange with undisguised interest. Anything to add, Miss York? Evelyn asked. Maggie leaned back in her seat, her smile sly. Only that Mr. Kingsley had a knack for making enemies. Take Camilla, for example. She worked closely with him, didn't she? Maybe too closely. Camilla stiffened. What are you implying? Nothing, Maggie said airily. Only that loyalty isn't everyone's strong suit. The tension in the cabin was mounting, each passenger's nerves frayed by the turbulence and the weight of unspoken accusations. Ava Sinclair, who had remained silent, finally spoke. This is absurd, she said, her voice trembling. Robert's gone. Can't we just let it be? Evelyn's gaze settled on Ava, her expression unreadable. Let it be? Or let someone get away with murder? Ava's eyes widened and she sank back into her seat, clutching her notebook as though it were a lifeline. The room descended into a brittle silence, the unspoken truth hanging heavy in the air. Evelyn knew the journal held the key to unlocking Robert's secrets, but the missing page loomed like a shadow over the investigation. Somewhere in the cabin, someone knew exactly what it contained, and they were willing to kill to keep it hidden. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin was brittle, every word and movement carrying the weight of suspicion. Evelyn Carter sat at the center of it all, her calm demeanor masking the storm of deductions swirling in her mind. The discovery of Robert Kingsley's journal had confirmed what she already suspected. This was no accident, no sudden act of nature. This was murder. The missing page nagged at her like a loose thread. It was the key to understanding the final moments of Robert's life, the piece that would complete the puzzle. Evelyn knew she couldn't accuse anyone without proof, and so, like a seasoned tactician, she began to weave her plan. After the dinner service concluded, Evelyn rose from her seat with deliberate calm. The other passengers were subdued, worn thin by the day's events and the weight of unspoken fears. Evelyn's voice cut through the silence, steady and commanding. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe it's time we spoke openly about what's happened here. All eyes turned to her. Camilla Harrington's pale face registered apprehension. Victor Lyle sat rigid, his fingers drumming nervously on his armrest. Dr. Alan Pembroke adjusted his tie, a thin sheen of perspiration glistening on his brow. Maggie York looked intrigued, her tablet resting forgotten on the tray table, while Ava Sinclair clutched her notebook as though it were her last line of defense. Evelyn's gaze swept the group, her tone measured and calm. We all knew Mr. Kingsley in some capacity, and whether we admit it or not, his death has affected us all. Perhaps we can make sense of it together, for closure if nothing else. The silence that followed was deliberate, a net Evelyn cast into the room, waiting for the first ripple. Camilla broke it, her voice faltering. It's no secret that Robert and I had disagreements. He accused me of mishandling funds, but he was wrong. I would never do something like that. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, her expression neutral. Yet he was threatening you, wasn't he? Demanding repayment? Camilla hesitated, her hands twisting the hem of her blouse. Yes, she admitted quietly. He said he had proof, but he refused to show it to me. I didn't have the money to fight him. I thought if I kept working for him, I could fix things. Did you ever consider retaliating? Evelyn asked softly, her tone neither accusatory nor comforting. Camilla's head snapped up, her eyes wide with something close to panic. No. I wouldn't. I couldn't. She trailed off, her voice breaking. Evelyn nodded and moved her attention to Victor Lyle, whose discomfort was evident in his darting eyes and tense posture. Mr. Lyle, you've been uncharacteristically quiet. Perhaps you have something to share? Victor shifted in his seat, his gaze flickering nervously around the cabin. I knew about the corruption in Robert's foundation, he said finally, his voice low. He wasn't as clean as he wanted people to think. But I didn't kill him, I swear. What did you know about the journal? Evelyn asked. Victor's eyes narrowed. Nothing, I saw him writing in it, but I never touched it. Whatever was in there, it wasn't my concern. Maggie York leaned forward, her sharp smile cutting through the tension. Funny you'd say that, Victor. Everyone here knows Robert liked to hold people's secrets against them. I'd bet good money you had more to lose than you're admitting. Victor flushed, his jaw tightening, but he said nothing. Evelyn turned to Maggie, her voice deceptively light. And what about you, Miss York? You've been watching all of this unfold with an unusual level of interest. Perhaps you have something to add? Maggie's smile didn't waver. Oh, I'm just here for the show. But if you're fishing for dirt, I'd look at Ava. Word around the tech world is that she's not as squeaky clean as she pretends to be. Ava flinched, her hands tightening around her notebook. That's ridiculous, she said, her voice trembling. I didn't even know Robert until this flight. Didn't you? Maggie pressed, her tone almost mocking. Because I could swear I've heard otherwise. Something about a deal gone sour? Or was that just gossip? That's enough, Evelyn interjected firmly, her voice cutting through the rising tension. Ava's face was pale, her breathing shallow. Evelyn filed the reaction away, knowing it might prove useful later. She turned to Dr. Pembroke, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. And you, Doctor? You seem unusually reserved for someone in your profession. Alan's jaw tightened. I have nothing to add. Robert and I crossed paths professionally, but that's all. Didn't he invest in one of your ventures? Evelyn asked, her tone casual but deliberate. Alan's hand jerked involuntarily, knocking his water glass over. He cursed under his breath, grabbing a napkin to blot the spill. That was years ago, he snapped. It has nothing to do with this. Perhaps, Evelyn said, her voice even. Or perhaps you're hiding more than you're letting on. The tension in the cabin grew suffocating, the air thick with unspoken accusations and rising fear. Evelyn decided it was time to spring her trap. I should mention, she said, her tone deliberately casual, that I spoke to the head flight attendant earlier. We've been in contact with the authorities on the ground, and they've shared some preliminary toxicology findings. The room went still. Evelyn let the silence linger, watching the ripple of reactions, Victor's tightening jaw, Camilla's wide-eyed confusion, Maggie's sly amusement, and Ava's trembling hands. Evelyn continued, her gaze steady. It seems the poison used wasn't ordinary. It was a very specific compound, something rare and traceable. The authorities believe they'll be able to identify the source and the person responsible within hours of landing. A sharp intake of breath shattered the silence. Evelyn's eyes snapped to Ava Sinclair, whose face had drained of color. The young woman's hands shook as she pressed them against her lap, her gaze fixed firmly on the floor. Evelyn let the moment stretch, her voice calm but laced with quiet authority. Panic isn't the reaction of an innocent person, Miss Sinclair. Would you care to explain? Ava said nothing, her silence as damning as a confession. Evelyn leaned back in her seat, her expression unreadable, as the cabin descended into uneasy quiet once more. The trap had been set, and the killer had taken the bait. It was only a matter of time now. The first-class cabin of the transatlantic flight had descended into a fragile silence, as if the weight of suspicion had finally subdued its occupants. Evelyn Carter, her mind a carefully tuned instrument of observation, sat still, her eyes closed as if in rest, though her thoughts were far from tranquil. The earlier confrontation had fractured the group's tenuous composure, and now the pieces of the puzzle hovered in her mind, seeking their rightful places. Evelyn's memory returned to the moments before the turbulence, replaying them with a nurse's precision. Robert Kingsley's drink. She remembered it distinctly. Camilla Harrington had handed it to him, her expression tense as though the simple act carried unseen weight. But Robert hadn't finished it. Had he? Evelyn's mental reel clicked forward past the chaos of the turbulence to the moment when the glass was no longer in its original position. The drink had moved. Evelyn was certain of it. Her sharp mind traced the chain of events. Camilla's trembling hands passing the glass, the turbulence that sent belongings tumbling, and Ava Sinclair's calm amidst the storm. Too calm. Evelyn's eyes opened and her gaze settled on Ava, seated a few rows ahead, staring blankly at the seat back in front of her. Evelyn rose, the creak of her seat audible in the stillness. She approached the head flight attendant, who stood near the galley with a wary expression. "May I ask for your assistance?" Evelyn inquired softly. The attendant nodded, following Evelyn as she gestured toward Robert's seat. I'd like to examine the area again, Evelyn said, her tone firm but polite, specifically the glass he was drinking from. The attendant hesitated before retrieving a pair of gloves and handing them to Evelyn. The glass sat innocuously on the tray table, a chilling reminder of the events that had unfolded. Evelyn lifted it carefully, examining the rim. Her breath caught when she saw the faint smear near the edge, an oily residue invisible to the untrained eye. Cyanide, Evelyn thought grimly. It was a faint trace, but unmistakable. The toxin's bitter almond scent had been an early clue, but this confirmed her suspicions. The glass had been tampered with. She returned to her seat, her mind racing. The missing journal page had hinted at financial fraud tied to Robert's foundation, but who among them would have acted so brazenly? Camilla had been accused of embezzlement, but her panic was genuine, and she lacked the cold calculation necessary for murder. Victor Lyle was evasive but unconvincing as a killer. Maggie York enjoyed stirring trouble, but her interests were in stories, not silencing them. Dr. Pembroke had motive, yet his discomfort suggested guilt of another kind. Ava Sinclair, however, stood apart. Her ambition was palpable, her veneer of poise cracking at the edges. Evelyn replayed Ava's reaction to the mention of toxicology results, the sharp intake of breath, the sudden pallor. There was no mistaking it. Ava was terrified. Evelyn pulled out the journal she had recovered from the trash bin, flipping through its cryptic notes. The missing page was still a glaring absence, but Evelyn had tucked a loose fragment into the cover, a corner torn from the missing sheet, bearing a partial name, Sinkle. The plane's soft lighting cast a glow over the page as Evelyn's thoughts crystallized. Ava Sinclair was the connection. The fraud Robert had uncovered was tied to her, and she had known the missing page would incriminate her. The journal had been discarded in haste, but not before Ava ensured the vital evidence was gone. It was sloppy, a crack in the otherwise calculated facade. Evelyn rose again, this time addressing the entire cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I must insist we have one final conversation. It's important." The passengers turned to her with varying degrees of wariness and irritation. Ava was the last to meet Evelyn's gaze, her eyes darting toward the journal in Evelyn's hand. "During the turbulence, I noticed something peculiar," Evelyn began. "Robert's drink was moved. Camilla handed it to him initially, but someone else switched glasses in the confusion." The cabin erupted in murmurs, but Evelyn raised a hand for silence. "I have evidence here," she said, holding up the journal. "This fragment, torn from the missing page, links directly to one of you, Ava Sinclair." Ava's composure shattered like glass. Her hand shot out as if to deny the accusation, but her trembling fingers betrayed her. That's absurd," she stammered. "Why would I?" Evelyn's voice cut through Ava's protests, calm and unyielding. "You had everything to lose, didn't you? Robert's foundation was about to expose your fraudulent credentials, the missing funds, the falsified investments. It all pointed to you. Killing Robert wasn't just revenge, it was self-preservation." Ava's face turned ashen. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came. Evelyn pressed on, her tone sharper now. "You poisoned him during the turbulence, didn't you? Switching glasses was a clever move. You assumed the chaos would obscure the act." Tears welled in Ava's eyes, her trembling hands clutching the edge of her seat. "I didn't mean to," she whispered, the confession slipping out like a sigh. He wouldn't stop. He said he'd ruin me." The room fell silent. Evelyn stepped back, allowing the weight of Ava's words to settle over the group. The head flight attendant moved forward, her expression a mixture of shock and determination. "We'll notify the authorities," she said, her voice steady despite the tension. Ava sank into her seat, her head in her hands as the cabin seemed to exhale collectively. Evelyn returned to her seat, the journal resting on her lap. Justice had been served, but the echoes of the night would linger long after the plane touched down. The descent into New York was accompanied by an eerie stillness in the first-class cabin. The hum of the engines and the occasional chime of the seatbelt sign punctuated the silence as the plane began its final approach. Evelyn Carter sat upright, her hands folded neatly over Robert Kingsley's journal, her mind both restless and resolute. Ava Sinclair remained in her seat, her once confident facade entirely eroded. Her eyes were hollow, staring blankly ahead as though she had already resigned herself to the inevitability of what was to come. The head flight attendant had ensured Ava would remain under close watch until the authorities could intervene. Evelyn had offered her guidance, subtly reinforcing the importance of securing both the journal and Ava's belongings for evidence. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing at John F. Kennedy International Airport shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and prepare for arrival. Thank you for your cooperation during this challenging flight." Evelyn's gaze swept the cabin one final time. The other passengers were subdued, each lost in their own thoughts. Camilla Harrington sat rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Victor Lyle stared out the window, his face a mask of grim contemplation. Dr. Alan Pembroke leaned back with his eyes closed, though his jaw remained tightly set. Maggie York, ever the observer, was quietly typing notes into her tablet, her expression unreadable. As the plane touched down, the jolt of the landing gear meeting the tarmac seemed to jolt the cabin back to life. The usual flurry of activity followed, the clicks of seatbelts, the rustle of bags being retrieved, the muted conversations of weary travelers. Yet in first class, the atmosphere remained heavy, the weight of the night's events still palpable. 2 uniformed officers were waiting at the gate as the passengers disembarked. Ava's pale face flushed as they approached her seat, and she allowed herself to be escorted off the plane without protest. The journal, sealed in a secure envelope, was handed over with Evelyn's quiet insistence that its contents be thoroughly examined. Evelyn lingered near the gate, her eyes following Ava as the young woman was led away. There was no satisfaction in the scene, only a quiet relief that justice would take its course. She turned to the head flight attendant, offering a faint smile. "Thank you for your cooperation," Evelyn said softly. "You handled a difficult situation with grace." The attendant nodded, her composure finally cracking to reveal a flicker of gratitude. "And thank you, Mrs. Carter. I don't know what we would have done without you." Evelyn's footsteps were steady as she moved through the terminal, her mind heavy with reflection. Robert Kingsley's death had uncovered a tangle of secrets, each more complex than the last. Yet it was Ava Sinclair's desperate act that had brought those secrets into the light. Evelyn couldn't help but wonder how many others carried such hidden burdens, their polished exteriors masking the weight of extraordinary truths. As she made her way through customs, Evelyn's thoughts turned briefly to her late husband. His voice, warm and encouraging, echoed in her memory. "Adventure is where you find it, Evelyn. You just have to be willing to look." He had always embraced life with a spirit of curiosity and courage, qualities Evelyn now realized she carried forward in her own quiet way. The cool New York air greeted her as she stepped outside, the bustle of the city a stark contrast to the confined tension of the plane. Evelyn paused, breathing deeply, the chaos of the terminal behind her and the sprawling skyline ahead. In her heart, there was a sense of completion, a quiet acknowledgement that justice had been served. As a taxi pulled up to the curb, Evelyn climbed in, setting her bag beside her. The driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Where to, ma'am?" Evelyn smiled faintly, her voice steady and calm. "To adventure," she murmured, more to herself than to him. The car pulled away from the curb, merging into the flow of traffic, and Evelyn allowed herself a moment of peace. The night's events were behind her, but their echoes would remain. Ordinary lives, she thought, often concealed the most extraordinary secrets. She resolved, as she had so many times before, to keep looking.